Our earth has got enough for everyone's need, but not enough for anyone's greed. Hello and welcome to The Analyst, dated 22nd of April, which is also celebrated as the Earth Day. In today's news analysis, we look into the following news articles. First of all, on the occasion of Earth Day, we will do 3 editorial analyses that are featured in the Hindu newspaper. Then, we will analyze the train accidents in India as recently an investigation report is out from the government. Then, we will learn what is the 4th global mass coral bleaching event, which has struck the major coral hotspots of the world. Then, we will look into the tax collection trends of the country as recently the net direct taxes have seemed to be surging at records high. Then, we will look into Mpox virus and some related terminologies. And we will wind up our discussion with prelim snippets, which are extremely crucial for the upcoming prelims examination. So, let's get started. So, in the first article, we have picked up 3 editorials for discussion. These are featured in the Hindu newspaper. First one is preparing India for water stress, climate resilience. The second is dealing with the challenges of renewable energy. And second is how to balance the climate change along with nutritional and food security. So we'll be analyzing all of them in this particular segment, extremely important for the examination and also a relevant discussion for the day. So first of all, to begin with, Earth, a blue planet lying in the Goldilocks zone, having perfect conditions to survive life on it, is the only known planet with life, but it has also got major issues. Can you name one of the major issues? It is, of course, the global warming. Not that global warming has not taken place across the geological cycles of the earth. Yes, it has. But this global warming is a concern because it is happening at an accelerated, unprecedented rate, which is very, very difficult to mitigate and keep up pace with. This global warming or this unprecedented climate change is degrading a lot of Earth's intrinsic resources. So what it is leading to? Depletion of the resources. Can you name some of the resources which are getting depleted? Basically, most of them. But there is water, there is biodiversity which is getting depleted. Then we have got land resources which is getting depleted, because of which the food systems which are raised on this land is also depleted. Therefore, because of degradation of the food land, food systems are compromised, and therefore food security of the world is also compromised. Now these 3 resources, because there is a lot of degradation happening on them, they are sources to the major conflicts, major socio-political and economic conflicts that you see around you. So all of the things are interrelated to each other. Of course, we as humans would make efforts to ensure our survival, because any whichever way, the earth is good enough to keep on its survival. So naturally, if earth is in trouble, then we as humans will definitely be in trouble, in one form or the other. In the first editorial, we will discuss about India's climate and water challenge, which are interrelated to each other. How climate change aggravates the water crisis in India. First of all, the discussion should start with highlighting the scarcity of water resources, the edible and the consumable fresh water resources in India. India is a country which entails 18% of the total global population, with just about 4% of the total freshwater resources, which can be consumed by the humans. Of course, this creates a demand and supply influx, and therefore, the first problem that we face is limited freshwater resources. We have got huge streamlines of river, networks of river, but nearly half of our rivers are polluted. You have already heard about the Meethi River of Mumbai, which is the most polluted river in the world. Then 150 primary reservoirs, the tanks, especially feeding the Deccan India, all of them are working with just 38% capacity. In fact, a lot of zero water days observed in Chennai, observed in Bangalore, are because of the depletion of these water tanks and some of the rivers. Then the freshwater boundary has also got transgressed to about 32%, as highlighted by a Niti Aayog report in 2023. So this makes us understand that we have got a limited supply of the freshwater resources. Now, what about the groundwater usage? India is the largest user of groundwater, and about 3/4 of the India's districts or the groundwater provinces are hotspots for the extreme climate events. Extreme climate events, for example, the heat waves, for example, depletion of the groundwater, pollution because they are sitting in the heavy industrialized belts of India. Also, they are cyclone prone, and therefore, as a result of this, the groundwater is also consistently becoming unfit for usage. One such example could be the inundation of the salt water or intrusion of the salt waters from the coastal areas because of cyclones or because of tsunamis or because of melting of the glacier leading to rise in the sea level. This is drowning the land. Drowning the land means some of the incursion of salty water which is unfit for the use is getting inside into the groundwater over here. So you can see the coastal provinces and the groundwater over here is also stressed. This is a map which elaborates that about 54% of India faces high to extremely high water level stress. This is exacerbated by the climate change events. One such event which is taking around the newspapers is the heat wave, because it has been declared by IMD that this year is going to have intense visuals of heat waves in India. Heat waves are those conditions where we see a prolonged sustenance of temperatures more than or up to 4 degrees centigrade for plains and 30 degrees for the hills. So if there is a sustained temperature of 40 degrees for, let's say, 4 to 5 days in a plain area, then this is known as a heat wave condition, and this is also considered as a disaster because it has got multiple implications. One of the implications it has on water is that it fastens up the evaporation, especially of the groundwater of the lakes, etc., which leads to again degradation of the water resources and the water availability. This will also make the land infertile. This will also compromise with the water security. You will not be able to pursue agriculture with that much intensity. It will lead to crop wastage as well. So heat waves are further exacerbating the water stress. Not only that, because of the rising temperature, we are also seeing intensification of cyclones. Now, cyclones, as I've already told you, when they hit the lands, they causes inundation of the salty water. They also drown the lands. They also degrade the areas and destroy the livelihoods, etc. So, therefore, there are two aspects of climate change. One is the heat wave, second is the intensification of ENSO phenomena or the El Nino phenomena, and also the cyclones. All of them exacerbates the issues of water stress in India. Now, this is a multifaceted concern because now the climate shocks are not only sporadic, but they are very, very intense, as can be seen in the cases of cyclones, as can be seen in the rainfall patterns. You just now see that a lot of rainfall happened, and out of no reason, probably because of heavy intensification, huge low pressure creation because of the heat waves that are coming. So first is climate shock, which are rather sporadic but very, very intense, so that we are not enough prepared regarding our climate preparedness or disaster preparedness with them, and then their related water disasters. So we see sudden shocks, like for example, we see heavy rainfalls here and there. Then we see rapid water availability decline at the same time. Some of the tanks are drying down, whereas on the other hand, so you can see that in some parts of the regions like Rayalaseema, you will be seeing deserts or hydrological deserts because of loss of water. And in some of the regions, for example Meghalaya, we see there is a lot of rainfall is happening, and as a result this is getting flooded. Many of the regions are getting flooded. In fact, urban floods are also happening because of urban heat island effect to some extent. So therefore, sudden shocks are leading to both these dichotomies. On one hand, we are getting floods, on the other hand, we are getting desert-like situations. Then there are periodic stresses like reduced soil water retention and rainfall pattern challenges. This along with some of the hydrometeorological disasters, because it has been highlighted that 75% of the natural disasters that have happened across the world, in fact in the last 2 decades, were water related only. Now to understand this, let's traverse throughout the geographical areas of India. So in the Himalayas, you see melting of glaciers. Melting of glaciers is happening. GLOF related disasters are happening. Glacier lake outburst flows are happening. Why? Because of climate change, and these are hydrometeorological disasters. Next, we come to the northern plains of Uttar Pradesh. There we are seeing hydrological disasters in the form of droughts, because a lot of heat waves are coming, and these heat waves are causing massive crop failures, and these are the main agricultural revolution belts of the India. So therefore, if decline in crop productivity happens here, then the decline in food security also happens. Next is Next is, of course, we move to the Deccan region. In the Deccan region, we will see a lot of drying of the rivers, which are not perennial in nature, first of all. So there is already water scarcity, then there's drying up of the tank as well because of the heat stress conditions. So therefore, they see a lot of droughts. You have already seen Chennai having 0 water day in 2020. And then news of Bangalore drought is also taking rounds of the newspapers right now. Then we move to the coastal areas. Now coastal areas are getting duly inundated by the salt water intrusions, and this is happening because of intensification of cyclones. So can you see, most of the disasters are happening and driven by the hydrological parameters or hydrological reasons only. So flood associated events in India has increased up to 20 times between 1970 to 2019. This has also been highlighted by this editorial. You can pick this up for your mains answers. The problem with this is that we know that a lot of disasters are coming from hydrological point of view. But at the same time, are we prepared enough? No, because they are very sporadic, very intensive and very difficult to predict. And therefore, traditional seasonal responses are deemingly insufficient. Now, you have to understand the centrality of the water before discussing anything further, which is mentioned in this editorial. It says that water is connected to everything. Water is in the hydrological processes. Water is also a critical component of the food systems, of the energy systems as well. How energy systems and how food system? Water ensures, in fact, a lot of groundwater, in fact 69% of the total groundwater and the reservoir water is used for agricultural purposes only. So if this water declines, then our agriculture systems will also decline. Now talking about the energy system, how is it fueling energy? Renewable energy, for example, the green hydrogen would be produced by the hydrolysis of water only. Hydrolysis of water will give you H2 and O2, and this can be utilized as a fuel. For that also, you require huge amount of water. Not only that, the hydrothermal plants that you have, the hydroelectric plants that we have, all of them also requires water. So therefore, they are key critical components of our economy. They sustain agriculture, they sustain energy sector and whatnot. And of course, the food production and the nutrition that we consume. So what are the ingredients of water security that we must ensure? First of all, it should come from the policy and governance domain. Policies must recognize that water is key critical component across, which is interconnecting multiple components, the food system, the security system, the habitat rights, the energy systems, etc. So what do we need? We need a food, land and water nexus. How can we ensure? By developing or adopting a watershed management approach. So basically, you take the entire watershed of, let's say, the Ganga, and then you try to develop the communities, you try to conserve water over here, and you take a more landscape based approach as compared to a particular river approach, because water doesn't work in silos. Rainwater breeds the tanks, that breeds the rivers, river breeds the oceans, and there is a whole hydrological cycle that we have already learned in NCERTs. So basically, taking a comprehensive landscape approach for policy implementations related to water governance is the need of the hour. Second, we need to promote efficient use of water. Already water is limited. Now, if we are wasting it or if we are illegally consuming it, this will lead to wastage of the water. In fact, this will lead to water insecurity. In fact, it will also devoid some people of their intrinsic water rights because their waters have been diverted to somewhere else. So therefore, efficient use of water is the need of the hour. For that, you need conservation, you need water harvesting principles, you need community participation more so over. So focus on blue and green water use efficiency is extremely important. What is blue water and green water? Green water is that which comes from the rainfall, which comes from monsoon or rainfall, and it can be used efficiently with the help of rainfall harvesting technique. Blue water is any water which is coming from the tanks or which is coming from the lakes and rivers on the overground sources. So these are overground or underground sources. So these are the blue resources, and they, as I've already told you, 67% of them are used in agriculture, then about the next 30% is used in industrial purposes, so on and so forth. So we need to improve their efficiency, their usage efficiency in agriculture sector and industrial sector to improve the efficiency of this water, the blue water. Then we also need to target water use efficiency and reducing the non-revenue water. What is the non-revenue water? Suppose a water has been supplied to you of, let's say, of 3 gallons, but you have only received 2 gallons. So where has this 1 gallon went? This is a non-revenue water. Probably it has been bypassed via illegal metering or illegal channel, or it has been sourced illegally, or it has become polluted, or it has leaked from the pipeline. So you have not got your due rights, you have not got the amount of water you have paid revenues for. This is the non-revenue water. To deal with this, we have got the Har Ghar Jal Yojana for piped water supply. This will improve the efficiency. We have also got the Atal Bhujal Yojana. Atal Bhujal Yojana to save the groundwater, and this will help us to improve efficiency of the blue waters. Okay, then we also need to incorporate water accounting principle. How much water is allocated, how much water is discharged, provided, supplied and used for what purposes. We need to have a water accounting and the similar principles of the green accounting that we are performing right now. Okay, now we also need finances in order to do anything, and about anything we need money, we need finances, and it should come from global cooperation. So the first thing is, just like we had green bonds which facilitated the fund pooling towards investment into building the green infrastructure, similarly we should have some blue bonds also which can facilitate investments into certain water structures, especially the harvesting structures or watershed management structures, etc. Then market innovations like green credit program is also required. Green credit program will ensure that some kind of subsidized loans will be provided to the state government or to the local authorities or even to the private NGO communities who are willing to contribute in the water harvesting and conservation techniques. In the next editorial, we will look into the challenges and opportunities of renewable energy. Sure, renewable energy is a way forward. We all are looking towards moving into a low carbon footprint economy. But at the same time, there are certain challenges. And in this particular editorial, they have featured the case study of solar power projects. So we know that India is taking large strides, huge strides in pursuing solar power projects. But some of the issues that comes with renewable energy should also be assessed, mitigated, and then provided a solution for. First of all is the land requirement. If you want to install solar panels, you will not be able to do that in just 1 to 2 feet of square room. You would be requiring lot of lands for it. So till now, the amount of land that has gone for our solar panels settlement or infrastructure development is about 200 square kilometers for the current solar parks in India, and we are about to extend them. We are about to develop more solar parks. So in the coming future, we might go from 200 to about 50,000, 75,000 square kilometers of land just dedicated for the development of renewable energy. So what we require certain vertical development of infrastructure, not horizontal expansion, because see, if you are taking land for solar power parks, there's an opportunity cost for that. You are taking land from something else. Probably it could have been used for food, for raising food or growing millets or doing something else. So that is the first issue. Second is the impact on the local people. There are 2 case studies featured in the editorial. One is from the Bhadla, Rajasthan, where farmers have faced a loss of their sacred lands and shrinking grazing lands. Why? Because the government takes up the lands which are considered as the wastelands, and if a land suits this criteria, then government starts building solar power on them, of course taking them on lease from the particular owner. But most of the times, these wastelands are also the lands which are incorporated as sacred land or entails under the Forest Rights Act. They are entitled to the forest communities over there. So there are some social impacts as well. That is the loss of sacred lands, loss of grazing lands as well. In the Pavagadh, Karnataka, which entails one of the largest solar parks of the India, farmers have definitely benefited from leasing the land to the government and gaining revenue from that. But at the same time, they face the challenges of water security and economic disparity. Only the farmers who were able to lease, they became very, very rich as compared to others who could not lease their land. So therefore, economic disparity happened and water security also happened, because probably these were the sources where there were potential groundwater recharges. So of course, these are again some of the local impacts. The third thing is resource competition. Of course, if you are building something over there, you're compromising some other resource utilization. So let's say solar panel cleaning requires a lot of water amount to be used for the cleaning. Second, it has potential competition with other things. For example, agriculture. For example, food security. As I've already told you, you would have grown grown crops on it, or you could have utilized this water which is getting used for the cleaning. You could have utilized it for some other purpose. Then there is biodiversity loss as well. Have you heard about this news of the great Indian bustard being killed because of the solar electrification? The entire lines that are led in Gujarat and Rajasthan, that is the talk of the hour these days. So biodiversity loss, especially of the birds, avian population, is also taking place. These are also same concerns with the other power projects, for example, the wind power project, the hydroelectric power project, etc. Of course, solar power park has been covered over here, so we'll be limiting our discussion to this. So approaches to sustainable renewable energy development has also been given by the editorial. They have shown that we can have community ownership model. Let community take the lieu of this land. They generate the resources, they generate the electricity and use it for ensuring their own energy security, their own energy needs, and utilize that. They will be able to probably use the resources more judiciously as compared to government. Then assess the environmental and social impact before allocating that land, so that it doesn't infringes with any ecologically sensitive zone. It doesn't coincided with any forest right land which is accorded to the indigenous communities. Then we also need to revise how we do the wasteland classification, so that such of the lands, critical lands, the ecologically sensitive ones, the forest light lands, they don't come into the wasteland classification. Then of course, what is the need of the hour? To basically converge the agricultural practices and to utilize some of the photovoltaic practices into the same, which means to basically have a convergence or utilizing the solar energy to power the agriculture in India. So we can use solar pumps, etc. Do you know a scheme for this? So government has launched a scheme to incentivize installation of solar pumps. This is PM Kusum scheme. So these are some of the way forwards. Now in the next discussion, we will link up climate change with food security and women. So first of all, with regards to food production, what is the dichotomy that is taking place? The first thing is we have got insufficient amount of food production. It has been highlighted by the Rome Declaration. Please remember, Rome Declaration is related to nutrition and the food security issues of the world. It has highlighted that 800 million people around the world are lacking the reliable food sources, leading to aggravated malnutrition and hunger issues. Many are dying out of hunger. There is hidden hunger as well, where 2 billion people suffer from iron and zinc deficiencies, which is very crucial for development of bodies, especially for the mothers, especially for the women. Then India's nutritional landscape specifically is compromised in this regard. We've got the highest number of wasted and stunted children, and 32% of the children under 5 are underweight. 74% of our population cannot afford a healthy diet. In fact, our diet ideas are also very different as compared to the Western dietitian ideas. We consume more of carbohydrates, we consume more glutens, so the amount of nutritional balance is always compromised in Indian diets, and that is also not getting satisfied. Now there is rise of non-communicable disease in India, mostly from the dietary practices. For example, the cardiovascular diseases, the diabetes, etc., obesity that people are getting because of the faulty food systems. Now this has also decreased yield and quality due to climate change, which means that we already don't have insufficient food system, and now when situations like heat waves and cyclones and other things which will deplete the water quantity in the soil will happen, this will lead to drought, this will lead to land degradation. Land degradation will further compromise with the food creating capacity of the soil, and therefore what will happen? Further yields are predicted to go down. In fact, the qualities of the soil, of the crops that are created, will also go down. It has been seen in a lot of crops, for example, maize and tomatoes. The amount of lycopene contained in tomatoes and also some amount of enzymes contained in onions are also seen to be on decline. And the reason for this is climate change, the low quality, poor quality of the land. So we are also, you must have heard about the Save Soil campaign. So that is also in regards to saving the soil, because if you save the soil, you will save the hunger situations or the food security, the nutritional security, which is extremely essential for survival. Now, the first thing was insufficient food. The second is inefficient food systems. Food systems are also somewhere responsible for contributing to climate change. You have already heard about the rice farming and the poultry practices, which are the biggest culprits of methane emissions. Methane, a very potent greenhouse gas. So our food systems are also leading to 1/3 of the total global greenhouse gases. So the need of the hour is basically to shift our food approaches from a animal-based diet to a more plant-based diet. And in plant-based diet as well, we need to move for more climate-resilient crops, which are also rich in nutrients. These are the millets. So millet economy is further need of the hour. Now we look into another aspect where we will see how women are interrelated to nutrition and climate resilience. Women in particular are one of the highest sufferers and the most vulnerable community with regards to these 3 C's. So when the COVID happened, the one who suffered the most were the women. Then when the climate change happens, again the women. Then whatever conflicts happen, the most exploited and the most marginalized section becomes the women again. So therefore, we have to link, it becomes very intrinsic to safeguard the rights and provide some of the benefits to the women in order to mitigate with the climate change, because they will ensure that we are also getting nutrition. Now, very brilliant case study has been featured in the 3rd editorial. It has talked about the Kham Dogri village of Chhattisgarh. Here, with the help of some technical interventions and with the help of some institutes, Public Policy Institute of IIT Delhi, researchers from there and some NGOs have came together to build self-help groups, to finance them, to educate them, to create sustainable multi-layer farming. Basically, they will be allotted some packet of land. This will be about 10 decimals of land, which is roughly about 4,000 square feet, I think. So about this much land is created for a cooperative pooling, and this is given to a self-help group which is led by the women's. Now in this packet of land, they are doing farming at 4 levels. See how brilliant this idea is. At the root layer, they are raising radish and beetroot. At the surface layer, they are growing the leafy vegetables. Above the surface level, they are growing brinjals. Then some of the creepers, in like bottle gourds, long beans, etc. And additional plantation of papaya trees are also done. So from the same patch of land, you are able to produce lot of products, lot of commodities. This will help us to do multiple things. First of all, it's empowering the women, giving them economic security, giving them some financial benefits. Second, it is safeguarding the land because all these practices are organic in nature. Second, it is good utilization of the land, so in order to ensure the food security as well. So therefore, this case study can be used in your essays, in your GS papers as well, to quote how sustainable land management practices can help us to become more climate resilient and at the same time ensuring food security. So this was all about the discussion from these 3 editorials. Now in the next article, we will cover the railway accidents. Now railway accidents have been in news because in the last year, 2 disasters happened with regards to the Indian Railways. One was the Balasore train accident and the second one was the Vizianagaram of Andhra Pradesh. So some of the train lapses happened and an investigation committee was formed for the same, and investigations report are finally out. So therefore, we will be reading about the scenarios of railway accident, why do they happen and what is the way forward. Now, even if the Indian railways have improved drastically, still the security concerns and the rising railway accidents are still a source of menace. So, to understand, we need to read this NCRB data, National Crime Control Bureau, published in 2021, and analytics, which said that more than 16,000 deaths that are happening and more than 1,800 injuries that are happening in India is because of the railway accident. So railway accidents have not really improved. In fact, they have exaggerated more. Then, if you talk about this particular graph that I have showcased, of course, you can see there is decline in the railway accidents, but the share or the percentage of collisions which are leading to these safety issues or safety failures, that is on a rise. What do you mean by that? There are multiple reasons why two trains can collide and have accidents with each other. One and the foremost reason is collision between them. Second is because we have level crossings. Then because there can be derailment because of faulty tracks. Then there can be fires as well. But if you see the percentage of the collision, that is on a rise as a percentage to the overall accidents happening. So therefore, there are legitimate railway accident concerns. So what is the primary causes of railway accidents in India? The first one are the deep infrastructural issues that our railway infra has. First of all, the tracks that you see and the bridges that you see through which these trains are crossing by, they are faulty, they are aging, often they are vandalized, picked, and they are torn by the people who are trying to agitate against the government or the state for their demands. So vandalism is often seen. All their anger is generally vented out onto the public infrastructure like buses and railway tracks. So this also degrades the quality of track. Second, natural disasters like earthquake, they can also degrade the structural stability of the track. So basically, our tracks are not very intact, our bridges are not very intact. That's the first thing. Second, we have got lack of funds. If we don't have the fund, if we don't have the money, as I've already told you, how will the government take up the upgradation process of these bridges and tracks? So that is also compromised. Second, routes are operating for over 100% capacity. Of course, if one route is having 100% capacity, there is more congestion and more likelihood of collision of the trains. This will also naturally give stress and strain to the railway tracks as well. So they will also now become faulty because of the pressure of the trains. So many trains on one particular route. So therefore, congested routes are also one major culprit. Second is of course the driver or the human error. Corrupt drivers, negligent drivers, drivers who disregard the safety rules, Indians who have the habit of overspeeding, they want to reach everything before time even if they always get late. So overspeeding is again an issue. Miscommunication between two drivers is a major issue that is seen in Indian infrastructure and Indian railways infrastructure, and wrong signaling. So these are some of the human errors. Then there are some technical errors, for example, the signaling failures. Even if the human has sent the signal, it doesn't passes to the upcoming driver in the right time. So therefore, technical glitches are there, power outages can happen, and some human errors along with technical errors can happen. For example, in the Balasore railway accident last year, it was seen that there was a change in the interlocking system and it was not communicated between the two loco pilots, and as a result, both of them collided. So these are some of the reasons. How can we mitigate them is the thing we have to look forward for. How can we enhance safety? To give them money, provide them funds. Has Government of India not done it already? Yes, in 2018 it provided for a Rashtriya Rail Sanraksha Kosh of 1 lakh crore rupees for upgrading the infrastructure, for providing more safety features. So funds enhancement is the first thing. Second is to eliminate the level crossing. Do you know what is level crossing? Where when both the transport services, that is the pedestrian crossings, this is the pedestrian crossing, this is where your cars and trucks are moving, in fact you're walking through it, and at the same level the train is also created. Obviously, it will lead to collisions. It will lead to accidents between both the things. Therefore, there's an elimination. There's a need to eliminate these level crossings. We need to either build under bridge or over bridge. Okay, so both the things shouldn't be in the same plane. Next is to adopt advanced technologies which can communicate better and which can restrict the happening of any accident. So this can be, for example, the Kavach system. Kavach system is an indigenously created system which provides automatic brake whenever something is coming close to the radar. So anti-collision system Kavach is there. Then automatic warning systems and control systems should also be deployed. Ultrasonic flaw detection should also be deployed in order to understand the cracks and the rifts that are created in the tracks, in order to ensure and in order to have a good analysis, technical analysis of the laying down bridges and the tracks. Second, GPS based fog pass device, so that fog can also be an impediment in navigating the routes for the loco pilots and for the trains. So for that we need to have GPS based fog passing devices. Some of the best practices we can take up from UK, we can take up from European train control system, we can take up from Japan because they also mitigate the earthquake disasters and earthquake related train accident with the help of earthquake early warning system. One thing common to all of them is proper communication. The loco pilots are provided with audio and visual sort of messages every time they pass a red signal or any train is approaching them, or whenever earthquake or any disaster is about to happen. This is not so in Indian system, so this is the need of the hour. We can learn from these countries. Then resource management is very important. The people who are working as a rail staff, first of all, they are overburdened. They not only perform the functions to ensure the safety, but also some non-safety functions. For example, often deployed in catering department, cleaning department. We can outsource that work from them so that they can we can have a particular resource, ground force for ensuring the safety of railway operations. This has been recommended by Bibek Debroy Committee in 2014 to outsource the non-core work, that is the cleaning work and the catering work, to other staff. Second, performance-linked incentives should be provided to the people who are achieving their due targets so that they can be incentivized and we can have a sense of good competition, healthy competition across the different railway lines of the India. Then confidential incident reporting and analysis system should also be there. It's just like Whistleblower Protection Act, where if somebody is revealing a fault that is happening at administrative level, at technical level, at engineering level, then the person gets incentivized and not punished. So this CIRUS system can also be included. Then of course we need an independent statutory body which is particularly dedicated towards ensuring railway safety. So we can create a Railway Safety Authority as recommended by Kakodkar Committee in 2012, which will ensure that there are proper rules, ensure proper compliances, proper audit and proper investigation. This is how we will be able to create a safe railway infrastructure in India. Now jumping on to the third topic about the tax collection surge in India. So recently, a provisional data has been released by the Finance Ministry which showcased that there is an uptick in the total net direct tax collected from India, which is basically accrued to two rises. Rise in the personal income tax collection and rise in the securities transaction tax. These two have risen. On the other hand, the corporation tax has deflated. So first of all, let's have a look into what is direct taxes and how are they different from indirect taxes. So let's say you are some person who have received an income, you have provided certain services to the government. You have provided services to the government of one kind or the other. So you have generated some wealth out of it in return or some income out of it. In lieu of collecting this wealth and income, you will be providing some money back to the government, some share of it as decided by the government back to the government. But yes, this transaction is happening directly. I am directly providing a share of my tax or of my wealth, of my income and of my wealth to the government. So this is a form of direct tax because no intermediary is involved in this. But let's say, for example, I'm sitting in a pizza parlor and I have purchased a pizza and it accounted me some rupees. And this rupee again has to be deducted. This rupee has again to be deducted and given back to the government. But now we have an intermediary in between who is a seller. So seller will be collecting the tax from me and then giving it back to the government. So this is an indirect tax. Direct taxes are progressive in nature, which means the amount of tax that a person has to give will depend upon increase or rises on his income. Of course, it doesn't make any sense. If somebody is having just 1 lakh rupees as income and somebody having 1 crore as income should be equally be in the same bracket of tax subjection, let's say of 5%. 5% for a 10 crore person is nothing, but 5% for a 1 lakh slab person is huge. So therefore, what India performs is progressive taxation. So for somebody who's raising 5 lakh, there is no tax. For somebody who's having 10 crore, he'll be levied with some 30% of taxes with some surcharges. This is progressive taxation. This allows equitable distribution of resources in the country, which is also in the DPSP Article 39B and C. Now, when you talk about indirect and direct taxes, indirect taxes are regressive, direct taxes are progressive. Direct taxes actually help in controlling the inflation, whereas on the other hand, indirect taxes aid or indirect taxes are the culprit of building inflation in the economy. So I hope you've understood these two things. Now, what are the examples of direct taxes? We have got income tax, we have got corporation tax, capital gains tax, property tax, security transaction act, tax, and then in the indirect taxes one, we have got the VAT duties, excise duties, custom duties. In fact, the goods and services tax, all of them are indirect taxes of India. Now, let us understand some of the taxes in detail. What is this personal income tax which has seen a surge? So personal income tax is any tax which is levied upon a person who has gained some income or raised some wealth. So some percentage of it based on the progressive taxation. As you can see that if you have raised an income of up to 2,50,000, there will be no taxation for you. Then if you are in the bracket of the 7 lakh to 10 lakh, then 15% will be there. If you are beyond and above 15 lakh rupees, then this will be about 30% of the taxation that you have to pay. So this is progressive taxation, and it is levied on all the incomes except for the agricultural income. On agricultural income, there is no tax in India. Next is the corporate tax. So if there is a corporation or if there is a registered firm, see, if there is an unregistered firm, or if there is any entity, or if there is any Hindu united family, undivided family, and any individual, then they will be levied with a personal income tax. But when it comes to a corporation, specifically a registered or listed corporation, then they have to pay additional to PIT. They have to pay the corporation tax as well for raising this business. But sometimes not everybody has to pay this, because there are certain government rules which provides for leeways for some of the corporates. Taking advantage of that, sometimes the corporates misuse it. They don't put up their entire records and reveal it to the government about their transaction, about their revenues. So therefore, they end up paying no tax. To deal with this, government has introduced the minimum alternate tax, which every corporation, a minimum amount of tax which every corporation, irrespective of where it is living, where it is located, or how much profit is it making, it has to give this MAT tax, minimum alternate tax. This is also a form of direct tax. Then you have got Securities Transaction Act. Now, Securities Transaction Act tax is that which is raised on any kind of share that you hold, any equity that you hold, any options or any trading options that you have. So on all of that, a tax will be levied. Then there will be capital gain taxes. Capital gain taxes are levied on something which is basically the capital good. For example, the house that you rent, the house that you have, or the land that you have, or let's say some jewelries, or let's say some gold that a person might have. So all these things will also be levied with a capital gain tax, and all of them are the direct taxes. Why are the direct taxes beneficial for the economy and for the people? First of all, it is progressive in nature, which means it tries to bring social equity. It tries to distribute excess amount of money from the very richer classes towards the other people, towards the relatively poorer classes. Why? Because there is progressive taxation, as we have already seen. Then it gives certainty, because it is duly accounted and it's duly declared. Government will be assured that I will be getting 5% of tax. And this will also provide certainty to the taxpayer that my money is directly going into the hands of government. Second, it addresses inflation, because by increasing the direct taxes, government can actually try to control the inflation in economy. This is not so with the case of indirect taxes. Then it also makes government accountable, because I am assured that my money is in the hand of government. I will expect the government to perform good activities, developmental activities for me. Second, it obviously improves the fiscal health, because it is generating the revenues of the government. If you talk about how much money and from where India gets money from, as you can see from this graph, 35% of it comes from the borrowing and the liability, which is to basically fix the budgetary deficit that has happened, because probably government has made more expenditure as compared to revenue. To compensate for the same, it will perform borrowing and liability, borrowing and other activities. Then the second one is from the indirect taxes, that is the goods and services taxes. This is the second share. Next one is the corporation tax and the income tax. So if you get more income tax and more corporation tax, then of course the government's revenue will increase and government's developmental agendas will broaden, and they will try to provide more development for the people. Now, as we have seen this trend that the direct taxes are on a high, so what has been the reason behind it? The reasons are some of the government initiatives. First of all, reduction in the tax rate, especially the corporate tax. Previously taxed at 30%, now the corporates based in India only have to pay about 25%. Promotion of technology which removes any intermediate barriers. For example, the faceless e-assessment scheme, in which the taxpayer and the tax authorities engage with each other with the help of an online platform without actually revealing the identity or the face of the taxpayer, so that the taxpayer doesn't get bullied, or there is no mistreatment, and also there is no evasion of the rules by the tax authorities to give benefit of tax evasion to somebody. Then document identification number. A lot of tax compliant cases goes on here and there. The problem is with managing them and tracking them. So each of the taxation case is now given a unique number, which is the document identification number, so that it can be easily tracked. Next, reducing the litigation. by providing certain technological solutions again. So first is the advanced pricing agreement. This the taxpayer and the tax authority make a pre-agreement as to how much amount of tax will be paid, on what date, on what conditions, so that it can avoid future litigations. Second is Vivad se Vishwas, to have a technological intervention through which we can perform the litigations, or we can get the due redressal of our tax related complaints via the government support. So these are some of the government initiatives which has helped us to leverage and get a surge of the direct taxes. This fact I wanted to put forward, that as you can see, the amount of direct tax collection revenue varies across the states of India. Maharashtra being the one which provides 50% of the total direct tax collected in India. A very important fact. Now moving to a very interesting topic, coral bleaching. A US agency has revealed that the 4th global mass coral bleaching event has been triggered due to soaring high temperatures of the oceans. Again, a very important topic for the prelims examination and for mains. But before understanding coral bleaching, we will first understand what are corals. So corals or coral polyps are organisms which don't live alone. They live in a symbiotic relationship with an algae. And both these coral polyps along with the algae together make up the colorful, vibrant corals that you see right now. Corals are what? Corals are marine organisms which are of the phylum Cnidaria, and they have ability to sequester the carbon dioxide from the ocean waters or from the sea water. With the help of the sequestration, they are able to build certain tentacles or certain skeletons of what we call as reefs with the help of this calcium carbonate that they have sequestered. But they cannot raise their food from their own. They are not autotrophs. So they need some kind of relationship for this food. So there are two means through which the coral will be raising food. First of all, it has got tentacles. With the help of these tentacles or small hands, micro hands, it will be able to grab the phytoplanktons and then eat it. The second one is to live in a house. To live in a house where a tissue of coral polyp is habited by an algae which is known as the zooxanthellae algae. Now the zooxanthellae algae will be providing nutrition to it because it is an autotroph, and the zooxanthellae algae will be provided protection with the help of the skeleton, and the skeleton will also provide for the entry of carbon dioxide which will allow this algae to perform photosynthesis. So basically these corals that you see are not just one species, they are the coral polyps, and coral polyps along with coral skeletals, coral reefs, along with the zooxanthellae algae, which gives them bright colors and which also provides them nutrients. Now, in order to survive, you know that they have to perform photosynthesis because algae performs photosynthesis. So what are the conditions for survival of coral? You cannot see coral everywhere. The condition for survival of coral, first of all, is that it should be somewhere in the shallow water so that it can get the sunlight for the photosynthesis. Second, the water should not be a fresh water. We require somewhat saline water so that we can have calcium carbonate. Otherwise the reefs will die. Otherwise the minerals will not be extracted. The third thing is they want pollution-free water because these are very, very fragile relationships. The moment they get stressed, the algae starts moving away. In fact, the algae starts dying. So what leads to coral bleaching? How does this vibrant color gets to this stage? This is known as, this particular phase is known as coral which is bleached. And when it becomes completely white, then coral is named to be as dead. So what are the causes of coral bleaching? First of all, rise in oceanic temperature. They cannot survive in temperatures more than 23 degrees centigrade. And if you see temperatures more than 23 degrees centigrade roughly, that is happening because of heat waves, global warming, etc. You see coral bleaching. Then runoff and pollutions are also making their conditions stressful. The algae is leaving the coral polyps, leading to bleaching. Then overexposure of the sunlight also burns the algae. Then extreme low tides also take away or also depletes or basically makes it more vulnerable towards sunlight and the other events. So these are the reasons why this coral has become a dead coral. Now this global mass coral bleaching is not happening for the first time. It has already been said, it has happened 4 times. So when do we call any event as global mass coral bleaching event? when a significant coral bleaching is confirmed in all the coral hotspots. Coral hotspots are the Atlantic Ocean, the Pacific Ocean and the Indian Ocean, as you can see, because they have got the favorable conditions for survival of coral. In all these places, in fact, in 2024, it has been recorded 54 countries having corals. All of them have seen coral getting stressed. In 1998, for the first time, coral bleaching happened, but that time only 20% of the coral became stressed and soon after they recovered themselves. Then in 2010, the second event happened with 35% of the reefs affected. The third happened in 2014 to 2017, where 56% of the reefs were affected. As you can see the trend, that the amount of corals that are getting depleted is rising, is on a rise, which signifies that the temperatures are also accelerating, the pollution is also accelerating, so much so that they are not getting the time. In fact, it's also happening very, very frequently. In just 14 years, this has happened. So because it is happening very, very quickly, can we also say that this is unprecedented bleaching of coral, and that is why we are calling it mass global coral bleaching. And in the fourth one is happening, it started from 2023, mostly because the temperatures were up to 23 degrees centigrade in most of the oceans, and this was because of the ENSO, because El Nino condition that happened in 2023. So that, along with global warming, led to 54% of the world's coral area to be degraded and depleted, and also to be bleached. So this has become a major global concern right now, which needs to be prevented and abated. But more discussion on that laterwards. So now we are going to talk about the Mpox virus. Researchers have sequenced the genome of Mpox virus, which had a major outbreak in 2022. Mpox are DNA viruses. This is also an important fact. Now please understand that Mpox previously was known as monkeypox or monkey virus, because previous to 1970 it was believed that it only affects the monkeys. But in 1970 we saw the first ever human case got affected by monkeypox. So now it is named as the Mpox. Mpox, because it is no more just a monkeypox. It is now a zoonotic disease which can also get carried forward to humans and to other animals. So this is a viral zoonotic disease which is spread via a monkeypox virus. There are two known types of it. One that is originated from Central Africa, second in the Western Africa. As you can see, mostly it is in the tropical countries only. Some of the symptoms are skin rashes and mucosal lesions, fever associated, coughing and vomiting, etc. Very, very similar to smallpox. Therefore, it doesn't have medicine in itself. It doesn't have proper medications for itself. It rather uses the same medication used for smallpoxes. Now, a word is used in this particular text and science and tech section. This is genomic accordions. Genomic accordions have been revealed that they multiply themselves with the help of this particular term. What does it mean? It means the rhythmic genomic expansion, and not just expansion, but also contraction at regular intervals, which leads to the multiplication and fight against the different antigen responses of this particular genome of Mpox, of this virus. So this is known as genomic accordions. Talking about the virus are of two types. One that only contain RNA, for example the coronavirus, and one that only contain DNA. So the one who contain DNA are the hepatitis, the viruses that cause hepatitis or the other broader forms of diseases. This particular virus is also Mpox, smallpoxes, all of them are also DNA viruses. Now what is the difference between a virus, a viroid, and what is known as obelisks? This is a new term in use, so it's important. So first of all, virus was discovered in this year, not very important. Please understand it composes of DNA and RNA both. The thing with viruses is that it is a non-living thing unless and until it attaches itself to a living organism. So they are non-living organisms that require living cellular host in order to reproduce. It is surrounded by a protein coat. It is larger than viroid. So then what is viroid? Viroid is the smallest form, the most basic elemental form of infectious agent that is known. It is only a single stranded RNA. It is not more than that, and they are generally found to be infecting plants. A lot of plant diseases are from not the viruses, but from the primitive form of viruses, the most smallest form of infecting agent, the viroids. And something in between both of them are the obelisks. So obelisks are those which replicate in a very similar manner as just like viruses, but at the same time their structural simplicity is very similar to that of viroid. They also contain only a few strands of RNA in them, not more than that. So this is the difference between virus, viroid, and an intermediary between them, which is obelisk. Now moving on to the prelim snippets, we'll be quickly revising them. Some of the important ones are that the Peru-based Potato Research Center is set to set up in Agra. Then we'll be talking about some of the old age schemes which also stimulates the silver economy. Then we'll be talking about Myanmar ethnic rebels and the different areas where they belong to, and we'll be looking into what is disinvestment. So first of all, do you know that a Peru-based International Potato Center has set up its regional center, its South Asia Regional Center in India? It's a big feat for India. But the question might come to you that, ma'am, why Peru-based organization has got this International Potato Center? The reason for this is that the potato crop is native to Peru and the Andes ranges and the Peruvian Andes area. So therefore, they have got the International Potato Center. They have already set up a regional center in China, and now after that, it's going to be in India. India already has its own Central Potato Research Institute in Shimla. So why in Shimla? Because potato is a temperate crop. It generally grows in the subtropical and the temperate regions, and it requires, it can actually grow in all kinds of soil except for the alkaline soil and for the saline soil. So they cannot grow in the coastal areas. Other than that, they can grow anywhere in the heartland. Then they can be growth in both the times. They are of course requiring some good temperature, some mild temperature of about 20 to 23 degrees centigrade, not more than that. So for that, in the cases of summers, they can be grown in hills, and in the cases of winter, they can be grown in tropical regions. So of course, can Shimla grow it? Of course, Shimla can grow it because it's a winter crop, it's a temperate crop. So therefore, we have put up a research institute in Shimla. Now please understand, these are the potato producing belts of the India. Most of it, 37% of it is grown in the state of Uttar Pradesh only. So please kindly remember what are the potato producing states of India. India holds a rank of 4th in the total global producer of rank of potato all across the world. And one more fact, who brought potato to India? Was it native to India? No. So of course somebody brought it. So who brought it? Kindly answer in the comment section. Then we'll be reading about the senior citizen schemes, because recently government has launched some inclusion of senior citizen criteria in the Ayushman Bharat program. So what are these? First of all, the newly launched one is the Avyay program. This is the Atal Vayo Abhyuday Yojana. It is basically to provide or to incentivize, or the government will be providing some grant and aid to the implementation agencies which are providing the elderly people something like their health care or their medical care, or in fact their shelter homes, the old age homes. So these implementation agencies or these organizational agencies will be provided some money from the government through the Abhyuday Yojana. Second thing is, this is basically to leverage the elderly care, their socio-economic care can be leveraged. And second is also to provide grant and aid to create a stream of professionals which are experts in geriatric care. Geriatric care is where we are talking about the old age or the elderly people care. Next is Rashtriya Vayoshri Yojana. Vayoshri Yojana is basically to provide them certain life assisting devices, for example hearing aids and other implants, so that they can perform effectively, they can live their life in dignity, and they can perform the movements very, very actively. Now the next is the Sampann project. Now one of the main challenges faced by elderly people is that the getting back of their due income, their due pensions at the right time. So for that, an online portal is created for them to avail their pensions on an online mode. This is a Sampann project. Next, in order to facilitate and accelerate the silver economy, which is basically to utilize the potential and the wisdom of our elderly people who are above the age of 60 years of age, we have got two portals. One is the Sage portal. Sage portal will be providing online portal for all the entrepreneurs and all the startup ventures, so that they can create geriatric led solutions or technological solutions and provide startups in that regards. So for them, government has created Sage portal. Second is the Sacred portal. This will allow for registering of the old age people who are willing to re-employ themselves. So this will be providing re-employment. Then of course, for providing of pension, we have got Pradhan Mantri Vay Vandana Yojana. So Pradhan Mantri Vay Vandana Yojana will be providing what? The pension and the insurance support to the elderly citizens of India. These are some of these schemes. Now talking about the Myanmar insurgency, has been a lot in news because of rise of multiple ethnic rebels. So starting from the north, we have got the Kachins. Kachins we have already read, but it is in the northwestern part. Please remember, these are the Buddhist people. Also some of the Muslims ethnic groups are here. Then we have got Rohingyas, the most persecuted minority in the Arakan region. Then we have got the Rakhine state, and Rohingyas are generally in these Rakhine state only. Then the green ones you can see are the Karen ethnic group. Karen ethnic group, this is also revolting against them. Then we have got the Chin ethnic groups. Then we have got one more, the Wa and the Kokang Chinese. So because a lot of diverse ethnic groups are living, therefore this topic becomes important. You can be asked about the Karims and the Kachins, you can be asked about the Rohingyas and the Rakhine region and the Chin and the Karenis and the Mon and the Was. So please remember these ethnic minority groups, they can be asked in the examination. And finally, this is our last topic about the disinvestment. What do you mean by disinvestment? Investment is purchasing an asset, and disinvestment is losing your share of the asset. So when the government tries to loosen up its stake in a public sector enterprise, that process is known as investment or disinvestment, of course. So this can be done through two means. First of all, government can directly sell it to the buyer, or government can put these shares or whatever they have sold, these shares in the stock market. So there are two ways to do that. Which ministry or which department takes care of the entire disinvestment proceed? It is under the Ministry of Finance. This is the Department of Investment and Public Asset Management, DIPAM. Please remember this. Now, depends upon how much part of stake is the government giving off. On the basis of that, we can further divide disinvestment proceeds. It can be a minority disinvestment, a majority or a strategic disinvestment, or a complete privatization or complete disinvestment. Where the government is trying to disinvest or loosen up its share or a stake in the public sector enterprise, still retaining majority of it, which means it is giving not more than 49%. Maximum limit is 49% of the stakes are disinvested, which means the majority of the control is still with the government. This is known as minority disinvestment. Majority is when the government gives off stake more than 51%, which means now government holds less than 49% of the control. So the major control goes over the buyer, but only major control. Government still has got some role, some say in it, because still it holds some stake. But what if the government completely loses off the control, loses off the stake, gives off all the stakes? Then in that case, 100% of it, 100% of the control will go to the buyer, and this will lead to what we know as privatization, which is happening in Indian economy a lot. Anyway, where will all this, because government is trying to disinvest, because disinvestment will give it money, and all of this money should be used in a particular fund or should be collected in a fund. This fund is the National Investment Fund of 2005, which channelizes all the proceeds from the investment over here. Now please remember, one term has been mentioned: center may disinvest minority stakes in 5 public sector banks. The reason behind this is probably they are not compliant with the minimum public shareholding standard. This is the minimum standard, which means that at least for any listed company, 25% of the equity should be free floated to the market or to the public, basically to the non-promoters of the bank or the company. That is an essential criteria. Of course, government has got the power to exempt certain PSE or PSB from complying to this shareholding, but unless it does so, government disinvests its minority stakes. So this was all about today's current affair discussion. I know it was a long discussion. We covered a lot of editorials and a lot of articles. I hope it provides some leverage to your preparation. Thank you so much and have a nice day.